Welcome to our podcast series, Identity Dialoguing with the Other and Myself. Today we welcome John Moses, who is an Indigenous Canadian and Director of Repatriation and Indigenous Relations at the Canadian Museum of History. Welcome, John.
Hello, thank you for this opportunity.
Yes, thank you. So I wanted to start with asking you to tell us a little bit about your Indigenous origins and how this identity relates to you, and a little bit about the history of your Indigenous roots.
Okay, well, again, my name is John Moses. I'm a member of the Delaware and Upper Mohawk bands from the Six Nations of the Grand River Territory near Brantford, Ontario, Canada. So this is a First Nations community in southwestern Ontario. That's where both my parents were born and raised, and where the majority of my extended family members continue to live and work. The Six Nations territory was founded in 1784 following the alliance of the Six Nations Confederacy with the British at the time of the American Revolution.
Ah, very interesting. I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about how this identity, your Indigenous identity, and I know you grew up in the suburbs of Ottawa with me, and also how your relationship with the reserve, and a little bit about the matrilineal nature of your Indigenous roots. I wondered if you could tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, I can start off with explaining how our family came to be in the Ottawa area. My father was a residential school survivor and a naval veteran of the Korean War. Following his Korean War service, he transferred to the Royal Canadian Air Force. And I was actually born in Saint Hubert, Quebec, just outside of Montreal, which is where my father was stationed with the Air Force at the time, and where my mother worked as a registered nurse. As I say, both my parents were born and raised at Six Nations, but as a function of my father's service in the military, we spent time at various locations across the country. My father left the Canadian military in 1965 to pursue civilian employment with the federal government in Ottawa. So that's what brought our family to the Ottawa area.
So I know that you mentioned that you visited the reserve on numerous occasions, and that was quite important to you. I wondered if you might tell me a little bit about that experience going back to the reserve. Also, yeah, and a little bit about I think you mentioned something about your clan and how it relates to your mother rather than your father.
Yeah, well, certainly growing up in Ottawa, I guess the driving time between Ottawa and the Brantford area, it's about 6 hours all told. So it's a bit of a long drive, but not impossible. So we would go back a couple times throughout the year for different family gatherings and holidays and that kind of thing. So we still own property down there. We still have 50 acres of farmland on the reserve's Third Line Road that we rent out to a younger cousin of mine. So we've still got those, kinds of relationships down there, and we'll be going back down later this month, as a matter of fact, for a family reunion. So yeah, we're constantly in contact. When I was a younger kid, we would spend our summers down there. We had a trailer down on the reserve on an uncle's property where we would spend time each summer vacation. So those kinds of relationships. Now, in terms of the band membership aspect of things, I'm a status Indian registered band member within the meaning of Canada's federal Indian legislation called the Indian Act. Under this federal legislation, which is undeniably a colonial invention, band membership is traced through the father's side of the family. So it's patrilineal descent. Having said that, though, within traditional Six Nations or Iroquois culture, Haudenosaunee culture, descent and community affiliation is traced through the mother's side of the family. So according to the federal government of Canada, I'm a member of the Delaware band at Six Nations because that's my father's lineage. But within the traditional Haudenosaunee system of reckoning kinship in descent, I'm Bear Clan Upper Mohawk because that is my mother's clan affiliation, and that was her mother's clan affiliation, and her mother's clan affiliation back through time. So That accounts for myself identifying both as a member of the Delaware and Upper Mohawk bands at Six Nations.
Okay. And the relationship to your mother's clan, did this mean that there would be closer relations towards the mother's side than the father's side, or
Not necessarily. Like, I was
not
equally close. I am equally close to, cousins and
Mhm.
other relatives on both sides of the family, but just within the traditional system of Iroquois or
Well,
Haudenosaunee matriarchy, that's how tracing the clan descent works. It's through the mother's side of the family.
very interesting. I was wondering if you could describe the Indigenous identity in the Canadian context that it is administratively today. You did allude to it just previously, but how this differed in the past and understanding about administratively, how Indigenous identity is identified.
Certainly, well, the Indian Act is Canada's federal legislation under the original British North America Act of 1867, Section 9124, allocates the administration of Indians and lands reserved for Indians, as the wording actually states, to the federal level of government. So with the coming of Confederation in 1867, under the terms of the original British North America Act, it was understood that the administration of Indian affairs would be a federal or nationwide responsibility, as opposed to being delegated to the individual provinces or territories. And that being the case, what's called the first Consolidated Indian Act came into being in 1876, and it's been modified many times over the decades, and it remains the piece of federal legislation that continues to provide the federal level of government with responsibility for the administration of Indian affairs. And I'll point out too that Indian remains a legal term in Canada, to the extent that there is the federal legislation of the Indian Act and its continuing mandates. So although it's widely considered to be a pejorative term in many other usages, it does in fact remain a legal term here in Canada.
Yeah, I wanted just to allude to something from when we were children, when you once said to me, "You're an Indian and I'm an Indian too." Do you
Yeah.
recall that? It's stuck in
Yes,
my head for the last 50 years when
great
you said
years of
that to me.
understanding.
So
Oh yeah.
it's interesting. They were looking for us, but they found you.
Well, that's it. That's it. So it's yeah, it's a very long and convoluted history, and
Yeah.
I know people are often confused by the different terminologies. I think many people within North American borders anyways recognize that the term Indian in many contexts is, as I say, considered to be pejorative terminology, but it does remain a legal term within Canada's modern constitution, the Constitution Act of 1982. The term that's used is Aboriginal, and Aboriginal is collective terminology that refers all at once to First Nations, i.e. Indian, but also Métis and Inuit. So the Aboriginal peoples of Canada, as constitutionally defined, comprises First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. And then more recently, with the passage of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, that term Indigenous is now widely used within Canadian borders and internationally as well, when people are talking about international Indigenous rights in the global sense.
Yeah, I think this is extremely important. I'm very glad that you brought up the terminology, because with regards to changing it from Indian to Indigenous to Aboriginal, does that give us a stronger sense of empowerment or agency for Indigenous people to having changed the overall term in usage? Do you feel that
Well,
makes a difference?
Well, in some it might facilitate things in some instances, but not in others. I think whenever there's this blanket terminology used like Aboriginal or Indigenous, it always occurs to at least a certain extent. It always results to at least a certain extent in the erosion of an understanding of the uniqueness of each individual, Indigenous population across the country, and indeed in a global sense as well, too. So I had indicated previously that in terms of my own band membership at the Six Nations of the Grand River Territory, on my mother's side of the family, it's Mohawk. On my father's side of the family, it's Delaware. And even there, these are English language terms that have been applied to our respective peoples over the centuries. The proper term for Delaware is Lenape, and the proper word for Mohawk within the Mohawk language itself is actually Ganyengahega. So
Mm.
as we see these efforts to try and apply one single word to capture the totality of the Indigenous experience in Canadian or within North American borders, it always occurs potentially at the erosion of an understanding of the uniqueness of each individual Indigenous population from coast to coast.
Well, thank you. Very clear. I, we've talked a lot about the impact of policies of the past on Indigenous identity, and I wondered if you might speak to residential schools, which in personal experience, the impact it's had. I wonder if you might talk about how past policies have impacted Indigenous identity.
Yeah, well, certainly, on my mother's side of the family, and her maiden name is Montour, so her extended family, it's the Montour family. On my mother's side of the family, she had the benefit of being raised at home in a conventional or traditional Six Nations family setting, by her parents and with her siblings. Things were rather different on my father's side of the family. On the Moses side of the family, there are actually three generations of the Moses family, comprising my father, grandfather, and great grandfather, who were raised at the Mohawk Institute Indian Residential School in Brantford. And my father was there under exceptionally severe wartime and post-war conditions from 1942 until 1947. His father was there during the 19 teens, roughly at the time of the First World War. And my great grandfather was there even earlier in the 1880s. So that makes me the first generation after three that wasn't raised at the Mohawk Institute. That particular facility being closed as a residential school in 1970. So I believe it holds the unique distinction of being the longest surviving residential school in Canada. It was founded at some point in the 1830s, and it continued on right up until 1970. So, that's, a period of 140 years that we're talking about.
Mhm.
The school served different perceived needs during different decades. When my great grandfather Nelson Moses was there in the 1880s, it was essentially a religious training school where likely young men and women from the Six Nations community were sent to be trained as Indigenous Anglican clergy and teachers, with the intention that they would be sent out west as the process of signing the numbered treaties occurred across the western provinces and territories of Canada. So the idea, and this was run on a contract basis, basically by the Anglican Church of Canada for the government of Canada. The thinking at that point was that you would have, quote unquote, educated and civilized Indians from the eastern part of the country being sent out west to help with the process of assimilation in the western part of the country. That plan never panned out. Out of all the many dozens, if not hundreds, of students who would have been raised at the Mohawk Institute at that time period during the late 1800s. There was only a bare handful of people who ever did that. Most of the people, upon leaving the Mohawk Institute in that time period, just gradually melded back into the Six Nations reserve population. When my grandfather, Ted Moses, was at the Mohawk Institute in the 19 teens, it was largely run as a military themed boarding academy and this was sort of part and parcel of during that era of global militarization that would result with the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. It deteriorated throughout the decades of the 1920s and 30s and into the Great Depression. And unfortunately, by the time that my father and his siblings attended, he was there with a younger sister and an older brother. They were there from 19 42 until 1947. So basically at the height of the Second World War, and then into the few years following the Second World War. By that period, the government and the church had, even dispensed with any idea of providing the children with any sort of education or training. They were there to provide forced agricultural labor as a contribution to the civilian food production effort on the Canadian home front during wartime, because the residential school itself, aside from the building itself, it actually sat on 350 acres of prime southern Ontario farmland with varieties of crops and orchards and livestock under cultivation. So the children were put to work running that farm operation, as I say, as a contribution to the civilian food production effort on the Canadian home front at the time of the Second World War.
So I see a lot of interesting themes that come out of what you just described. One was this identity as clergy, and second, identity as military. And I know both your father and yourself, and perhaps your grandfather, were in the military, Canadian military.
Yeah.
And it's quite interesting, what this means with regards to an identity that was forced on you or that you took upon yourself due to these residential schools, and also whether your language and your culture were actually encouraged in these schools during the time. I wondered if you might comment on that.
Yeah, well, certainly there was no encouragement of the language or the culture. It was, the whole purpose of the schools was to assimilate Indigenous people into mainstream Canadian society, which necessarily meant the eradication of distinctive cultural expressions and that kind of thing, including Indigenous languages. So the children would have been, at whatever era they attended the schools at, they would have been severely punished if they were caught speaking their various Indigenous languages and that kind of thing. In terms of the military service, yeah, I guess my father in his own life and career exemplifies that. He was at the residential school, which, by the way, was called the Mush Hole. The nickname for the school was the Mush Hole, after the staple corn mush that formed the basis of their diet. He was there providing that forced agricultural labor, as I said, from 1942 until 1947. He went in when he was 8 years old and got out when he was 15, I believe, or just turning 15. And later himself joined the Royal Canadian Navy in 1950, and he served in the Royal Canadian Navy from 1950 until 1955, including Korean War service aboard a ship called HMCS Iroquois, Her Majesty's.
Oh, interesting. HMSC Iroquois. So it used a native
Yes.
term.
Yeah. I don't know if many of your listeners will be familiar with, sort of British and Dominion naval terminologies, but that moniker HMCS variously stands for His Majesty or Her Majesty's Canadian ship. And there was a particular class of destroyers during the era of the Second World War and the Korean War that were tribal class destroyers. And so in the Royal Canadian Navy during the 1940s and into the 50s, there were a number of these tribal class destroyers that individually bore the names of different First Nations groups. So, for example, there was HMCS Iroquois, HMCS Athabascan, Haida, Sioux, and
So
Cayuga.
do you feel that, interestingly enough, that you weren't allowed to speak your language or have your culture, but they appropriated a name for their naval destroyers? There's something quite sadly
Yeah.
ironic about that.
Yeah, certainly there's an irony there, and it was, that's a whole huge topic in itself. Is the British, or not the British, but sort of military appropriations of Indigenous terminologies, because of course there are all sorts of unhealthy or racist stereotypes that attribute extraordinary levels of stealth or cunning to Indigenous people. So it's something that you find with, I believe, military organizations right around the world. Basically, is the attempt to incorporate certain aspects of Indigenous iconography,
And identity.
for their own purposes. So.
Very, very interesting. I wondered if you could tell me a little bit about how your work has contributed to a dynamic construction of today's Indigenous community identity, and you have fascinating work, so I wondered if you could tell me a little bit about it. And
Yep, sure. Well, aside from my own time in the military, that basically, I spent 5 years in the Canadian military between high school and going back to college and university. So I, basically consider that to be my own sort of extended grade 13, I guess. But I, after 5 years in the military, I decided I wasn't going to be making a career of it. So I had always been interested in history, and I wound up taking a museum technology course at Algonquin College right here in Ottawa, which eventually led to work here at the Canadian Museum of History and elsewhere within the Department of Canadian Heritage. Subsequent to receiving my college diploma in museum studies, I completed degree work as well. So I have a diploma of applied arts and museum technology, a bachelor's degree in interdisciplinary studies, a master's degree in Canadian studies, and then I've completed coursework towards the completion of a PhD in cultural mediation. So all that to say, I'm currently the director for repatriation and Indigenous relations here at the Canadian Museum of History in Gatineau, Quebec, in the National Capital Region. We're a federal crown corporation within the Department of Canadian Heritage. Within the museum field, I had actually started out as an artifact conservator. So these are the people who do the hands-on repair and restoration of the artworks and the artifacts comprising museum collections. As a function of my initial training or my earlier training, I had the opportunity of completing internships at the British Museum in London, England, and then also with the National Museum of the American Indian when they were still based in New York City. They're now in Washington, D.C., but when I was with them, they were in New York City. That was in the mid-1990s. But yeah, the work that I'm doing right now, I've always sought, whether it's been working as a conservator or now doing the work that I'm doing as a museum director for repatriation and Indigenous relations, it's always been my goal to provide an Indigenous perspective and build Indigenous awareness within the federal museums and heritage sector. So,
and what would you consider this Indigenous perspective to be?
well, it's always making sure that, increasingly in this day and age, it's understood that museums are not operating in isolation. They're not relying on their own internal staff who, it remains a fact, are largely non-Indigenous. You can't have non-Indigenous peoples presuming to speak on behalf of Indigenous peoples within a museums and heritage setting. You need Indigenous experts on Indigenous issues, providing direct, unfiltered Indigenous perspectives on important matters. So, within my work right now at the federal level, that includes providing Indigenous perspectives within core museum functions comprising collections and research, exhibitions and programs, and then museum policy and administration.
So I'm kind of interested in knowing how artifacts contribute to the construction and investigation and feelings of Indigenous identity. Why artifacts? Why are they important? For the aesthetic reasons? What other reasons are artifacts important in contributing to identity?
Yeah, well, all of the above, really. Certainly, there's we're not just looking at the material aspects of the objects themselves, like their materials of manufacture and their sort of respective agents of deterioration and that kind of thing. We're very much interested in preserving the intangible cultural heritage that's embedded in objects as well. So if you think about the process of making and manufacturing any particular article or item of material culture, for example, a basket, for example, there are specialized Indigenous language terminologies used to describe the natural resources from which the basket is made. There are Indigenous language terminologies associated with the various steps throughout its process of manufacture. So with it's an interesting tie-in. Much of the work that I'm doing in repatriation right now is related to Canada's ongoing Indigenous land claims process. So we're still in the process of signing the federal government of Canada is still in the process of negotiating and signing modern treaties with Indigenous groups across all parts of the country, and within each and every land claim process these days, quite aside from those chapters of the final agreement document that have to do with the natural resources and governance and taxation and that kind of thing, there are equally detailed chapters having to do with culture, heritage, and language. So the basic premise there is that just as historically as natural resources have been removed from within Indigenous territories for export to Western or non-Indigenous markets, so too have cultural resources been removed from within Indigenous communities, leaving Indigenous hands to wind up in non-Indigenous museums, not just in Canada, but around the world. For example, you can find artifacts from my own community at the Six Nations of the Grand River. I've personally encountered them in museums spanning the National Museum of Argentina in Buenos Aires to museums in Moscow and St. Petersburg in Russia and at various
Wow.
in between. So there was a real global curiosity about Indigenous peoples from within North American borders and from across the Western Hemisphere, for that matter, that have resulted in Indigenous cultural properties from within Canada's present day borders can now be found in museums around the world.
So I'm asking a bit of a devil's advocate question, but having those objects in other countries, did that lead to a better understanding of Indigenous people in Canada by the fact that people can seize artifacts in other places? Or do you feel that these artifacts should stay within the communities themselves?
Well, certainly, it all relates to how they are presented, how they are interpreted, and within the modern day museum and heritage sector, not just nationally but globally, very basic issues about who gets to speak on whose behalf regarding representations of indigeneity in the museum and gallery space. And as I said earlier, from my perspective, we need indigenous experts on indigenous issues, providing direct, unfiltered indigenous perspectives on important matters, and that includes how to interpret indigenous material culture within museum settings. Having said that, the work that I'm doing in terms of repatriation, by definition, repatriation is all about the permanent physical return of indigenous cultural properties from museums back to their indigenous communities of origin. So that's what repatriation is by definition. Having said that, within a modern museum environment, repatriation itself in that sense is just one outcome along a spectrum of indigenous engagement activities. And here at the Canadian Museum of History, where I work, when we speak of indigenous engagement, we're talking about everything from the specialized training that we provide to Indigenous museology interns each year in this museum's Indigenous internship program, which this year, as a matter of fact, is marking its 30th year of operation, to our ordinary suite of short and long-term loans to various shared authority agreements, wherein objects will be shared back and forth between this museum and museum-like facilities within their indigenous communities of origin, and then indeed at the far end of the spectrum up to and including repatriation itself, which is the permanent physical return of selected items from the museum back to their indigenous communities of origin.
So what I understand is handling these objects with care and with having Indigenous understanding and perspectives in not just a piece of curiosity, but that it actually has the respect and
Yes,
care
yeah,
by Indigenous
yeah,
and also by sharing. Oh, that's really,
yeah.
really interesting. I actually had another question regarding religion and spirituality, and it comes back a little bit to the colonial times and how religion and spirituality has evolved in these communities over time. And I wondered if you might comment about that.
Well, certainly, it's not uncommon to you find many indigenous people today who, in terms of their personal spiritual views. They will embrace Indigenous spirituality at the same time that they might be active in some of the mainstream, Christian denominations, whether of the Roman Catholic or Protestant variety. So it's simply a fact of the history. In many Indigenous communities across the country, you get people practicing, at the same time that they continue to practice their respective brands of Indigenous traditional spirituality. They might be affiliated with any of the mainstream Christian denominations in that sense. So that's not uncommon. Certainly at the Six Nations of the Grand River Territory, where my family is from, there is people are there are some extended families who are adherents of the traditional spiritual movement called the Longhouse religion, or the Longhouse system of spirituality, at the same time that there are other families, like my own extended family, who are not of that persuasion, but rather are adherents of various Protestant denominations. So you will find variations of that within Indigenous communities right across the country, I would say.
So that's interesting. You did mention in a previous conversation that um, people could be adhering to Protestant Christianity at the same time conducting smudge ceremonies, or you mentioned something.
Yeah, there are different features that are, I would suggest, a hallmark of Indigenous spirituality, including pipe ceremonies and smudging ceremonies and that kind of thing. So depending upon what particular Indian Reserve community you're talking about, you will find, as I say, people exercising that kind of traditional spirituality alongside their participation perhaps in some of the mainstream religious denominations. And in some areas of the country, the Indigenous peoples, as a function of the history of colonialism and of religious conversion, are in terms of their conventional religious affiliation, they might be Roman Catholic. In other areas of the country, like at the Six Nations of the Grand River, the Mohawks of Tyendinaga, the primary Christian affiliation, I would suggest, is Anglican. And but at the same time, you'll get people within those communities who practice both traditional Indigenous spirituality alongside their church affiliation, whatever that might be. So.
Right. Well, I find this has been a fascinating discussion, and I wondered if you might leave listeners with maybe an understanding of what Indigenous identity means in Canada. Of course, it's all multifaceted, it's individual, it's
Mhm.
many different types of identities, but I wondered what you wish for, because I think you said something very interesting in a previous conversation about not including the Indigenous identity in the diversity, equity, and inclusion discussion. And I wondered if you might have something to say about that, if you might want
Yeah,
to.
yeah, certainly. Well, certainly in principle, I would suggest myself personally, and I would suggest most Indigenous people generally are obviously not opposed to the ideals of equity, diversity, inclusion, and access. But we have to be very careful here, especially within the Canadian context, both legally, whether we're talking about the mainstream Canadian legal system itself, or even within various Indigenous traditional law systems. Indigenous peoples in Canada possess constitutionally protected, what are called Section 35 Aboriginal and treaty rights, that do not accrue to other equity-seeking groups in Canadian society. That's just it's a practical and legal reality. So there's always a danger if Indigenous issues are lumped in with these other overarching, more generic discussions of equity, diversity, and inclusion. It has the potential to erode a knowledge or an implementation of unique Aboriginal rights, and thus rendering Aboriginal peoples or Indigenous peoples in Canada is merely another tile in Canada's overarching ethnocultural mosaic. And I would suggest if that occurs, that, that it has the net effect of accomplishing and completing the work of assimilation, where Indigenous peoples are, just rolled into this sort of overarching multicultural mosaic. It's on the one hand, everybody appreciates, or most people appreciate, the ethnocultural mosaic that is Canada in the present day. But as I say, that can't occur at the expense of a realization and implementation and respect for unique Aboriginal and treaty rights that simply don't accrue to other equity-seeking groups within Canadian society.
Well, thank you. That was very clear and a very in-depth analysis of the place of Indigenous people in their original homelands.
Right.
I really want to thank you, John. This has been a really fascinating discussion, and I hope we can continue to discuss.
Oh, yes. Thank you for the
Absolutely.
call. So.